The third thing I want you to think about is what Martha just raised this morning, and it's about the commission that was created at General Conference. That commission will do what I believe will be the most important work in the next decade of the United Methodist Church. In many ways, it will help us determine our future together if it is successful in creating a plan that will be accepted by a called session of General Conference or by the 2020 session, depending on when its work is completed. Now, the reason that we're before you today is I shared some slides Friday morning that numerous people have said have been very helpful. I participated in a confidential conversation called by Bishop Brown before and during General Conference that led to the bishop's proposal that has created this commission. It was not a secret meeting. It was not a smoke-filled room. It was a confidential conversation on a very difficult issue by a very broad spectrum when you think of that spectrum on an ideological basis. It was not, however, an inclusive or representative spectrum. And that's why it was best to hand this to the Council of Bishops, let them do their work, and then bring it to the General Conference, because they are a duly elected representative body of the United Methodist Church. I want to share with you some of the conversation that occurred in those meetings to help you understand some frameworks that affect us in our thinking about human sexuality. And many have found this is Tom Berlin's homemade thing here. Okay, so this is what you're getting. The labels are not mine. They come from Tom Lambert, who's with the Good News Movement, and I think Tom's labels are as good as I've seen. This is an attempt to simplify, but not be simplistic. Okay, so I understand that not every one of you are going to feel like you fall into one of these categories, but related to human sexuality, and for the purposes of this conversation, let's just talk about two issues. How do you feel about same-sex marriage in the church? How do you feel about the ordination of persons who are homosexual? Those are the only two things I'm talking about when I say human sexuality in this context. Most of us fall into one of these four categories, and this is what the conversation ensued, because when we got into that meeting with people on the left and people on the right and those of us who are in between, we made an instant decision. We said, we're not going to try to convince each other to change our minds. We're going to accept where we are and talk about where we're headed as a church. And we realize that most of us fall in one of these categories. On the right, there are traditionalists. They like the traditional stance of the church around those two issues. But some traditionalists are what are called non-compatibilists. They don't want to be in a church with people whose views differ from them. They feel so strongly about this issue because for them it's an interpretation of the authority of Scripture, it's an interpretation around what they believe to be true around sexual ethics and about personal holiness. You don't have to agree with them, but it's helpful if you understand where they come from. They don't attempt to be wounding, but they feel it so strongly that sometimes to those who are on the left, it is wounding. Then there are people that are next to them that are traditionalists who are compatibilists. And what that means is they hold traditional views around human sexuality, but they can live in a church where not everybody agrees and where practices can differ. They can live in a church where Church A might offer a same-sex marriage, but the church they serve, Church B, won't. They can live in a world where a pastor could perform an off-site same-sex marriage, but it wouldn't be done in the sanctuary. You see what I'm saying? They're traditionalists, they have their views, but they're compatibilists. They can be compatible with people they disagree with. Now, there are also people that are more progressive. That is to say, they would like to see the view on these two matters change, but many of them are compatibilists. They understand that some of their friends are traditionalists, and they don't agree necessarily. But we can live together, is what they would say. Because they have a value, these two groups have a value around the unity of the church as you find it in the Gospel of John. Now, I would argue that everybody has a value around that because it's a biblical value. But for some, these issues are so strong that they are willing to live separately, live apart based on it. Now, on the far left-hand side, there are progressives who are non-compatibilists. And what that means is they feel so strongly about these two issues, about marriage and ordination, that they would they're just to a place where it's an issue of justice for them. So they also have a scriptural viewpoint and a scriptural reference point, but it is a reference point of justice and equity in Jesus' ministry to those who are on the margins, who often feel that they're not included. And so what they look across this divide and they say, how can you interpret the scripture and not see the justice of Christ? And the people over here say, how can you interpret the scripture and not see what it says plainly around the actions around homosexuality? And that's where the argument is. And to my experience, when I was in this room talking to people that were on both sides of the spectrum, friends, nobody is going to suddenly say, wow, you're right. And my point is, it's not that we haven't thought thoroughly. It's that we have fundamental disagreements. And the question is, can these groups all get together? Now, here's where, in the United Methodist context, because you know what? The United Methodists, we are the broad center. The vast majority of us, if I got everybody in this thing to go to 4 quadrants that would define where you are, which I'm not going to do, thank you. But if I did that, most of us would fall in those 2 center areas. Most of us are compatibilists. And by the way, those that are non-compatibilists, that's why those of us who are compatibilists look at you and just like, would you stop talking? Like, we're tired. We're just tired of talking. You know, just figure out how to get along. And the folks on the edges are like, wow, you're so compromising of the fact, you know, you're just trying to always make it work. And that's why, listen, don't you feel like a lot of energy has been expended on this? Yeah, there is a feeling of weariness and exhaustion around this. And yet, these are identity issues. These are not trivial issues. These issues affect our children. They affect our friends. They affect us. And so we can't trivialize it. And even though we're weary with the argument, we've got to stick with it because we're talking about people's lives. So, next slide, please. What we'd like to believe is that the Book of Discipline binds us all together and we're all going to be fine. Next slide, please. We'd like to believe that the Book of Discipline has a magnetic field that holds us all together and we'll all just keep the Book of Discipline. But the problem is, in recent years, United Methodists, clergy and laity alike, are tired of holding the Book of Discipline when they believe it is a justice issue. And so, next slide, please. On the left-hand side of the spectrum, on the progressive side, people have gotten out of bounds with the Book of Discipline. Clergy have said, you know what, I'm going to do the marriage. We've had that happen in Virginia. And listen, I know the individuals who have done those marriages. They are good and decent clergy. They're effective clergy. But they have justice issues around this. And so when that happens, and we've got annual conferences now getting out of bounds related to ordination. And now people are saying, and the bishops are upholding it. And it makes the folks on the right-hand side very frustrated. And the folks on the right-hand side, next slide please, say, you know what, whenever you all get out of bound, our packet leaks. The clergy that serve churches that have a dominant ideology around these issues, they look at you and they say, look, every time somebody does a same-sex marriage in New York, or the annual conference in New York does this, I leak people in Texas. Because our people read the magazines, they read the newspapers, and the Book of Discipline is supposed to bind us. So now the issue is no longer what the Book of Discipline says, it's what we do. It's no longer sufficient for the folks on the right to just say, look, it's not just about the wording of the book. It's about whether we practice what the book says. And so next slide, please. Even the traditionalists that are compatibilists will say, you know what? We're losing members too, just not at the same rate as those churches that are described as traditionalist non-compatibilists. Are you with me so far? Okay, so this is a part of the issue. Next slide, please. And so what happened at General Conference this year is we had a couple proposals that said, hey, let's make it more stringent. If a clergy person does a marriage of a same-sex couple, they're out for 1 year. We're going to call that a just resolution, and if they do it twice, they're gone. We pull their credentials. Now, the court, the higher court of the church, which I cannot remember the name of. Yeah, the Judicial Council, thank you. The Judicial Council, it came back and said, hey, you can't do that. If you predefine it, it's not a just resolution. So all that legislation got thrown out. But the presence of that legislation tells you that the folks on the right are saying, we're going to draw hard boundaries and we're going to get people's behaviors in line with the Book of Discipline. But here's the problem. Next slide. What the folks on the left say is, when you make it so stringent, we leak people. Our people are walking away. Because our people, I had lunch with a pastor from a highly progressive church, and she said, I'm losing people. I had dinner Sunday night at General Conference with a clergy person who is connected to a lot of churches that are very traditionalist, and some that are non-compatibilists. He said, our people are losing people. It's very important for you to see this, because if we're going to ever have a decent conversation around this as United Methodists, we must develop empathetic responses to each other that are not always about human sexuality as a place to wound each other.